6 of Rocco Belandi's own men stood within close earshot the evening he leaned in close, in the middle of a crowded restaurant celebrating his own cousin's engagement, and told me quietly, in front of every single one of them, that he loved me. 3 simple words none of those particular men had ever once heard him say aloud in over 15 full years of collective service to his family. The entire table went completely silent, forks pausing mid-air, conversations dying mid-sentence. 6 grown men who had personally witnessed Rocco negotiate genuinely dangerous territorial disputes without a flicker of visible emotion, suddenly staring at their boss as though he had transformed, in the space of 3 quiet words, into someone none of them had ever actually met before that exact moment. I married Rocco when I was 27, a sommelier who had built a modest career consulting for restaurants across the region, and our own meeting happened through an unlikely professional connection, a restaurant owned by a distant relative of his requesting my expertise for an extensive wine program overhaul. I did not learn the full truth about his family's actual business until several months into our developing relationship, a revelation that arrived through careful, deliberate honesty on his part, once he judged our connection serious enough to warrant it. I remember that particular conversation clearly, sitting in the quiet back room of the very restaurant that had originally brought us together, listening to him explain, without any attempt to minimize or soften the reality, exactly what his family's business actually involved. I told him I needed time to process what this meant for us, and he gave me that time without pressure, understanding that a decision this significant deserved genuine reflection rather than any rushed reassurance from him. I did not walk away, though the choice required real reckoning with fears I had never previously needed to examine so directly. My own mother, a former social worker who had spent her career navigating complicated, sometimes dangerous family situations professionally, fired a considerably more measured reaction than I expected, telling me she had encountered plenty of men whose reputations preceded them unfairly, and that character mattered considerably more than profession when evaluating whether someone deserved my trust. I remember that particular conversation with my mother clearly, sitting in her kitchen on a rainy afternoon, watching her professional composure hold steady even as she processed news that would have visibly rattled most parents. She asked a series of careful, measured questions, the same methodical approach she brought to evaluating any complicated family situation professionally, wanting to understand exactly what I actually knew about Rocco's specific role within his family's business and how much genuine risk that role realistically carried. My father's reaction proved considerably more anxious than my mother's measured calm, and I remember him asking repeatedly, over several difficult conversations, whether I had truly considered every possible consequence of the path I seemed to be choosing. I told him honestly that I had spent considerable time working through exactly those consequences, that I understood the risks involved, and that I had concluded, based on everything I had witnessed during our courtship, that Rocco represented someone genuinely worth the risk despite the complicated world he came from. I found myself, during that difficult stretch of family reckoning, leaning heavily on my mother's more measured perspective, understanding that her own professional experience, navigating morally complicated family situations, gave her a specific credibility my father's more anxious worries simply could not match. She told me once, near the end of that difficult period, that she had watched Rocco interact with me at a family dinner and had noticed something she considered genuinely significant: the particular attentiveness he brought to listening rather than simply performing charm, a quality she said she had learned, across decades of professional work, distinguished trustworthy people from those simply skilled at appearing trustworthy. We married 18 months after that revealing conversation, guarded discreetly by men whose names I only gradually came to learn, and I remember standing at the altar, watching Rocco's face as I walked toward him, understanding that whatever complexity his world brought into our shared life, the man himself had never once wavered in his devotion to me. Planning that wedding introduced me to a considerably more complex side of Rocco's world than I had previously encountered, careful security considerations woven into every aspect of the ceremony's logistics, guest lists reviewed with an attention to detail that felt, at times, closer to careful diplomatic planning than ordinary wedding preparation. I remember a particular conversation with Salvatore, walking me through exactly which entrances would be monitored and which guests required additional discreet attention during the reception itself. I found this entire process simultaneously unsettling and strangely reassuring, understanding that the careful attention paid to my own safety during the wedding reflected the same underlying seriousness Rocco brought to protecting everything and everyone he genuinely valued. Salvatore told me, during that same conversation, that he had worked for Rocco's family for nearly 2 decades, and had rarely seen his boss invest quite this much personal attention in the security planning for any single event. Evidence, Salvatore said, exactly how significant this particular day actually was to him. The ceremony itself proceeded beautifully despite all that underlying complexity, And I remember a specific unguarded moment during the reception when Rocco, usually so careful about maintaining composure in front of his wider organization, allowed himself to simply enjoy dancing with me without any of his usual watchful vigilance, a rare visible relaxation that Salvatore later told me he had specifically arranged additional discreet security coverage to make possible, understanding that Rocco deserved at least a few genuinely unguarded hours on his own wedding day. My own parents, watching the same moment unfold, told me afterward that witnessing Rocco's genuine, unguarded happiness during that particular dance had done more to ease their remaining concerns than any conversation could have managed, evidence that our happiness together was authentic, rather than simply performed for an audience of still worried family members. The early years of our marriage taught me the specific rhythm of Rocco's carefully guarded public composure, a man who had built his entire professional reputation on a particular controlled reticence that revealed almost nothing of his genuine emotional life to anyone outside our own home. Salvatore, his closest lieutenant and oldest friend since their shared adolescence, watched our relationship develop with the careful, assessing caution I came to understand as standard practice for anyone entering Rocco's inner circle, an evaluation I apparently passed, though the specific warmth between Salvatore and me took considerable time to fully develop. Salvatore and Rocco had grown up on the same block in a considerably rougher part of the city than either of them currently occupied, and Salvatore told me once, years into my own marriage, that their friendship had been forged through shared circumstances few people in Rocco's current professional circles ever fully understood. Two boys learning early exactly how precarious ordinary safety actually was for people in their situation. I asked Salvatore, curious, what specifically had convinced him that my relationship with Rocco represented a genuine, lasting commitment rather than a passing romantic interest that might eventually fade. He told me it was watching Rocco's behavior during the specific weeks when my father's initial hesitation had created real tension in my own life, noting that Rocco had never once pressured me to simply choose him over my family's concerns, instead patiently demonstrating his own trustworthiness through consistent action rather than demanding I resolve my family's doubts on any particular timeline. There was a particular test, in the earliest months of our relationship, when Salvatore arranged, without Rocco's direct knowledge at the time, to have my background quietly and thoroughly investigated. Standard practice, he later explained, for anyone who came close enough to Rocco to represent a genuine point of vulnerability within the organization's careful security apparatus. I learned about this investigation only well after our wedding, and I remember the specific, complicated mixture of unease and understanding that particular revelation produced in me. Salvatore told me, when I eventually asked him directly about that investigation, that he had reported back to Rocco with genuine, unusual relief, having found nothing in those careful weeks except a woman with a consistent, verifiable history of exactly the kind of quiet, independent life she claimed to have built for herself. Evidence that I represented, in his own professional assessment, minimal risk and considerable genuine devotion toward his oldest friend in equal measure. I learned, gradually, exactly how rare it was for Rocco to express genuine affection verbally in any public setting, an emotional reticence he maintained even with me during our earliest years together, preferring instead to demonstrate his devotion through careful, consistent action rather than explicit declaration. I did not particularly mind this pattern, understanding it as simply his own particular way of expressing love, though I remember occasionally wondering, in our first year of marriage, whether he actually found the words themselves difficult to say aloud even in private. I did say them privately, eventually, roughly 8 months into our relationship, a quiet, careful declaration offered during an ordinary evening at home rather than any dramatic occasion, and I remember the specific weight of that moment, understanding how much courage it apparently required for him to voice something he clearly felt but rarely articulated directly. What he did not do, in all the years since that first private declaration, was repeat those words in front of anyone outside our immediate family, a specific, consistent boundary that had simply become an accepted feature of our particular marriage. I remember that first private declaration in considerable detail even now, an ordinary Tuesday evening, both of us simply sitting together on our living room sofa after an unremarkable dinner, when Rocco set down the book he had been reading and told me, with a specific careful deliberateness that suggested he had been building toward the moment for some time, that he loved me. I remember my own surprised silence in response, not because I doubted the sentiment, but because the directness of the declaration felt so uncharacteristic of his usual careful reserve. I asked him, that same evening, why he had chosen that particular unremarkable moment to finally voice something I suspected he had felt for considerably longer than he had ever indicated. He told me he honestly was not certain, only that the words had simply felt ready to be spoken, and that he had learned, watching his own father's lifelong emotional reticence, that waiting for some perfect, dramatic moment to express genuine feeling often meant the feeling simply went unexpressed entirely, a mistake he did not want to repeat in his own life. I found myself, in the months following that first declaration, understanding the specific boundary Rocco had established around when and where he felt comfortable voicing that particular sentiment, a boundary I respected without fully understanding its underlying logic until years later, once I had witnessed firsthand exactly how carefully he separated his private emotional life from the considerable public composure his professional world seemed to demand of him. Cousin Matteo's engagement dinner, the evening that eventually broke this particular pattern, gathered a considerable portion of the extended family alongside several of Rocco's most senior associates, a celebration held at a restaurant Rocco's family had frequented for decades. I remember the specific warmth of that evening, considerable laughter and genuine celebration filling the private dining room reserved for the occasion, nothing about the gathering suggesting it would eventually produce a moment his own men would apparently discuss for years afterward. I do not remember the exact conversation that preceded Rocco's declaration, some ordinary exchange about the evening's celebration, or perhaps a passing comment about how content the whole gathering made him feel, but I remember distinctly the specific quality of his voice when he leaned close and told me, quietly but perfectly audibly to everyone at that particular table, that he loved me. I remember the specific silence that followed, 6 of his men, present at that dinner in various capacities, going completely still, the kind of silence that carries genuine weight rather than simple quiet. I remember, too, the specific expression on Rocco's own face immediately after the words left his mouth, a brief flicker of surprise crossing his features, as though he himself had not fully anticipated saying them aloud until they were already spoken. He recovered his usual composure within seconds, but I had caught that fleeting moment of genuine surprise, evidence that the declaration had emerged from something closer to instinct than any deliberate decision on his part. I remember Matteo, the cousin whose engagement the dinner was actually celebrating, being among the first to break the silence, raising his glass with a slightly bewildered smile, and offering a toast to love in all its forms, a gesture that allowed the table's frozen tension to finally dissolve into somewhat awkward but genuine laughter. I found myself grateful for Matteo's quick thinking in that moment, understanding that his gesture had spared both Rocco and me from having to navigate the silence's full weight without some kind of graceful exit. Matteo told me, considerably later on, that he had actually felt a specific, unexpected responsibility in that exact moment, watching his own cousin's rare vulnerability hang exposed in front of the entire assembled table, and had made a genuine split-second decision to redirect the room's collective attention rather than let the uncomfortable silence stretch on any longer than felt absolutely necessary. I thanked him directly for that particular kindness once he finally shared this account with me, understanding fully that his quick thinking had genuinely spared both Rocco and me a considerably more uncomfortable, tended silence that evening. Matteo told me he had genuinely never once regretted that small interruption, considering it, in careful retrospect, one of the more meaningful contributions he had personally made to the wider family that particular year, despite how genuinely minor it might have understandably seemed to anyone entirely unaware of the fuller context surrounding it. Salvatore told me, describing that moment from his own perspective sometime later, that he had known Rocco for over 15 years by that point, had witnessed him navigate genuinely dangerous negotiations without a single visible flicker of emotion, had watched him deliver difficult news to grown men twice his age without so much as a raised eyebrow, and had never once, in all those years, heard him say those specific 3 words aloud in front of anyone beyond his own immediate family circle. I asked Salvatore once directly to describe, in as much precise detail as he could still remember, exactly what that particular moment had genuinely felt like from his own specific vantage point at the table. He told me he had actually physically stopped mid-conversation with the associate seated directly beside him, his own sentence simply trailing off entirely unfinished, his full attention suddenly and quite completely captured by what he had just directly witnessed, an experience he later compared to watching a familiar, well-known landscape suddenly reveal an entirely unknown feature that had somehow remained hidden from view for many, many years. Salvatore said the associate seated beside him, a considerably younger man still quite new to the organization at that time, had actually leaned over afterward and quietly asked, in a low whisper, whether what they had just witnessed together was truly as significant as it genuinely seemed, uncertain himself whether his own surprise reflected genuine rarity or simply his own limited experience with Rocco's usual demeanor around the table. Salvatore told him, quite plainly and directly, that it was exactly as significant as it genuinely seemed, and quite possibly even more so than that, an assessment the younger associate apparently carried with him afterward as one of his earliest, most formative lessons about the actual, genuine character of the man he had chosen to work for so faithfully. I asked Salvatore once, curious, What exactly had made that particular moment so significant to witness, beyond simple surprise at hearing words rarely spoken? He told me it was less about the words themselves and more about what they revealed, genuine crack in the careful, controlled composure Rocco had spent decades cultivating. Evidence that beneath the formidable public reputation existed a man capable of genuine, unguarded tenderness he had simply never before allowed anyone outside his immediate household to witness. The other 5 men present at that dinner, according to Salvatore's account, reacted with varying degrees of visible surprise. One younger associate apparently freezing mid-bite, fork suspended halfway to his mouth for several long seconds before he seemed to remember he was supposed to be eating. Salvatore said the entire table had simply stopped, conversations dying mid-sentence, everyone present understanding intuitively that they had witnessed something genuinely significant even before they could fully articulate exactly why it mattered so much. One of those 5 men, a considerably senior associate named Pharaoh who had served the family since Rocco's own father's era, told Salvatore afterward that he had actually felt his eyes unexpectedly welling with tears during that particular silence, reaction that surprised him considerably given his own decades of careful professional composure. He said something about witnessing Rocco's genuine vulnerability had unexpectedly moved him in ways he had not anticipated, specific tenderness he had not realized he had been quietly hoping to witness from the man he had served so loyally for so many years. Pharaoh eventually mentioned this reaction to Rocco directly, weeks after the original dinner, in a private conversation Salvatore later described to me. Rocco, according to Salvatore, had received Pharaoh's admission with genuine gratitude rather than any discomfort, telling the older man that his own emotional reaction meant more to him than Pharaoh likely realized. A small but significant exchange that apparently deepened their already considerable mutual respect even further. Pharaoh passed away several years later, and Rocco told me, at the small memorial gathering the organization arranged, that he had thought often, in the years since that particular conversation, about how grateful he was to have learned, directly from Pharaoh himself, exactly how much that engagement dinner had meant to him personally. He said that particular exchange had taught him something he genuinely considered valuable about the specific, quiet power of vulnerability, that it reliably created space for other people's own vulnerability to emerge in return. A lesson he told me he continued applying quite deliberately in his own ongoing relationships with the organization's other longtime, deeply loyal members over the years. I attended that particular memorial service myself, standing quietly beside Rocco throughout, as he delivered a brief but genuinely moving eulogy for a man who had faithfully served his family loyally across many decades of dedicated service. And I remember thinking, watching him speak with an ease and genuine openness that would have seemed entirely impossible during our own earliest years of marriage together, exactly how far he had traveled from the carefully guarded man I had first fallen in love with, considerable transformation that had genuinely begun, in some meaningful and lasting sense, at that very first engagement dinner all those many years earlier in our shared life. I asked Rocco himself, once we were finally home that evening, what had prompted him to say those particular words so publicly after years of careful private reservation. He told me, with more vulnerability than he typically allowed himself, that he honestly was not certain, that something about the warmth of that particular celebration had simply overwhelmed his usual careful restraint, the words leaving his mouth before he had fully considered the audience present to witness them. I remember sitting with him at our kitchen table that night, both of us still slightly stunned by the evening's unexpected turn, and asking him to try to identify the specific moment his usual restraint had actually broken. He described watching Matteo's own visible happiness throughout the evening, his cousin's face lit with the particular joy of new engagement, and feeling something shift in his own chest. A sudden, overwhelming awareness of exactly how much he treasured his own happiness with me, an awareness that apparently demanded expression before he could fully catch and contain it. I told him, that same night, that I had genuinely not minded the public nature of the declaration, understanding that whatever had prompted it clearly came from an entirely genuine place rather than any calculated decision. He told me he appreciated my understanding, though he admitted he still felt some lingering unease about how the moment might affect his standing among the men who had witnessed it, a concern I found myself trying to gently reassure him against without fully knowing, at that point, how the wider organization would eventually respond. I asked him whether he regretted the public nature of the declaration, given how thoroughly it apparently disrupted his carefully maintained professional reputation for emotional reticence. He told me, without hesitation, that he did not regret it at all, that if anything, he felt a specific relief at finally letting his men witness a piece of himself he had spent years carefully hiding, understanding that the hiding itself had perhaps cost him something he had not fully appreciated until the words were already spoken aloud in front of witnesses. I asked him to elaborate on what exactly the hiding had cost him, curious what specific loss he was referring to. He told me it was a particular kind of loneliness he had not fully named to himself until that evening, the accumulated exhaustion of maintaining a careful separation between the man his organization respected and the man who actually existed underneath that reputation, a separation he said had felt necessary for years, but that he now recognized as considerably more draining than he had ever consciously acknowledged. I found this admission genuinely moving once he shared it, understanding that the public declaration had apparently offered him something beyond simple relief, specific reintegration of the two versions of himself he had spent years carefully keeping apart. I told him I hoped he would continue allowing that particular integration to deepen, understanding that the specific loneliness he had just described sounded like something no one should have to carry indefinitely, however understandable its original origins might have been. I remember him taking my hand across the kitchen table that particular night, an unusually direct gesture from a man still relatively new to this level of expressed vulnerability, and telling me quietly that having me as a witness to this entire gradual unfolding meant more to him than he genuinely had adequate words to fully express. In all irony, neither of us commented on directly given the entire conversation's own particular subject matter concerning the specific limits of his verbal expression up to that exact point in our marriage. Salvatore told me, in the weeks following that particular dinner, that the incident had spread quietly through the wider organization, not through any deliberate announcement but through the simple, unavoidable fact that 6 people present had each independently found themselves unable to stop mentioning it to trusted colleagues. He said the reaction among Rocco's broader circle of associates had been almost uniformly one of quiet, prized respect rather than any of the mockery Rocco might reasonably have worried about. Evidence, Salvatore said, that a boss capable of genuine, unguarded tenderness commanded more loyalty rather than less among men who had spent their careers assuming toughness required the total absence of visible emotion. I asked Salvatore once directly whether he himself had personally been among those unable to keep the story entirely to himself, curious whether his own particular account of that memorable evening had contributed meaningfully to its considerably wider eventual spread throughout the organization. He admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he had mentioned it to his own wife that same night, unable to fully process what he had witnessed without discussing it with someone he trusted, and that his wife's own reaction, genuine delight at hearing such a tender story about a man she had always found somewhat intimidating, had confirmed for him that the story deserved to be shared, rather than kept as some private curiosity. Salvatore's wife, I later learned, had mentioned the story to several of her own friends within the organization's wider social circle, an entirely separate channel of transmission that apparently reached considerably more people than the original 6 witnesses ever could have managed on their own. I found this particular detail rather amusing once I finally learned it, understanding clearly that the story's wider spread had relied just as much on the wives and partners of Rocco's various associates as on the men themselves, specific irony given how carefully Rocco had originally tried to keep his own emotional life private from his professional world. I mentioned this particular irony to Rocco directly once, teasing him gently about how thoroughly his own careful, deliberate attempt at genuine privacy had ultimately completely failed given the story's remarkably wide and uncontrollable spread through so many multiple overlapping social networks eventually. He laughed, quite genuinely, telling me he had made peace with the story's inevitable spread fairly quickly, understanding clearly that trying to contain something so many people had already witnessed firsthand would have been an entirely futile, exhausting effort regardless of how carefully he might have otherwise tried to manage it afterward. There was a particular tension in the weeks following that dinner, when word of the declaration reached a considerably less sympathetic audience, a rival business figure who attempted to reference the incident dismissively during a tense negotiation, suggesting that a man capable of such public sentimentality lacked the necessary hardness for the position he held. I remember Rocco's careful, deliberate response to this particular provocation, refusing to publicly address the comment directly, trusting instead that anyone who actually understood how he operated would recognize the accusation as the empty provocation it actually was. That particular rival figure, a man named Corsetti who had built his own considerable reputation on precisely the opposite model of careful, performed hardness, apparently made the comment expecting it to genuinely rattle Rocco's composure during an already tense negotiation. Salvatore, present for that exchange, told me Rocco had simply looked at Corsetti for a long, silent moment before responding, a stillness Salvatore said was considerably more unsettling than any visible anger could have produced, before Rocco calmly redirected the conversation back to the actual business matter at hand, as though the comment had never been made at all. I asked Salvatore what he thought Corsetti's actual goal had been in raising the comment at all, given how unlikely it seemed to genuinely destabilize Rocco during serious negotiations. He told me he suspected Corsetti had simply miscalculated, assuming that any public display of tenderness necessarily indicated broader softness, A mistake Salvatore said several of Rocco's rivals had made over the years, each of them eventually learning, usually to their own professional detriment, that genuine tenderness and genuine strength were not actually mutually exclusive qualities in the man they were dealing with. I found myself, hearing this recurring pattern carefully described, genuinely curious just how many other rivals over the years had made this exact same fundamental miscalculation. Assuming Rocco's occasional public warmth necessarily represented some genuine strategic weakness they might eventually be able to exploit for their own advantage. Salvatore told me he had genuinely lost count over the years, that it seemed to remain one of the more persistent, recurring misunderstandings people continued making about Rocco specifically, an error he suspected stemmed from a considerably wider cultural assumption within their particular business world, a mistaken belief that genuine tenderness and genuine capability simply could not possibly coexist within the same person at all. That particular negotiation ultimately concluded in Rocco's favor, Salvatore told me, the rival figure's attempted mockery apparently backfiring considerably, several other parties present reportedly finding the attempted provocation distasteful rather than persuasive. Further evidence that genuine character, once witnessed clearly, tended to speak for itself regardless of whatever reputation management the wider organization otherwise required. Corsetti's own standing within that particular business community suffered a genuine, if gradual, decline in the months following that negotiation, several parties reportedly citing the incident as evidence of poor judgment rather than any particular strength on his part. I asked Rocco once whether he felt any satisfaction watching this particular outcome unfold, and he told me he felt something closer to simple vindication than any active satisfaction, understanding that Corsetti's own miscalculation had simply revealed itself naturally over time without requiring any additional intervention on Rocco's part. I found myself, hearing this fuller account, genuinely and quietly appreciating Rocco's specific restraint, in choosing not to actively pursue any further consequence at all against Corsetti beyond simply allowing his own poor judgment to naturally play out within the business community. I asked him directly whether that particular restraint had come easily to him, and he told me it genuinely had, that he had never once found any real satisfaction in actively punishing rivals for their own honest mistakes, preferring instead to let natural consequences unfold while he focused his own energy on the people and priorities that actually mattered to him. I asked him once, curious, whether this particular restraint represented a genuinely deliberate philosophy he had carefully developed over the years, or simply his own natural temperament quietly asserting itself whenever these kinds of situations happened to arise. He told me it was likely some genuine combination of both factors, explaining that his natural inclination toward restraint had been steadily reinforced over many years of direct experience, by watching how much more sustainable genuine, patient character actually proved to be compared to the more aggressive, reactive approach some of his own rivals consistently favored, an approach he had watched repeatedly fail, over time, to produce any lasting success or genuine loyalty worth having. I found myself, in the months following that particular dinner, understanding something about Rocco's emotional architecture that years of private marriage had only partially revealed. He told me, during a longer conversation about the incident's aftermath, that his own particular reticence traced back to his own father, a man who had modeled an even more extreme emotional distance throughout Rocco's entire childhood, never once expressing verbal affection to any family member regardless of the occasion or circumstance. I remember this particular conversation unfolding gradually over several evenings rather than all at once, Rocco apparently needing time to fully articulate feelings and memories he had rarely, if ever, put into words even privately with me before that point. I found myself grateful for his gradual openness, understanding that whatever process had begun at that engagement dinner was continuing to unfold in our own private conversations, slow but genuine dismantling of decades of careful emotional guardedness. He told me, during one of these later conversations, that he had actually feared, for years, that expressing genuine affection too readily might somehow diminish him in the eyes of the men who depended on his leadership, fear he traced directly back to watching his own father navigate the exact same professional world with an emotional coldness Rocco had once assumed was simply necessary for effective leadership rather than a personal limitation his father had never worked to overcome. He described a specific memory from his own adolescence, watching his father attend an important family celebration with the same careful, controlled composure he maintained during even the most routine business dealings. An emotional flatness Rocco said he had absorbed, unconsciously, as simply the correct model for how a man in his eventual position was supposed to comport himself. He told me he had spent years assuming this particular reticence represented strength rather than simply an inherited limitation, only gradually coming to recognize, through our own marriage, that genuine strength and genuine tenderness were not actually opposing qualities at all. I asked him what specifically had begun to shift his understanding on this particular point, curious whether some concrete experience had prompted the gradual reconsideration rather than simply abstract reflection over time. He told me it had been watching me specifically navigate our own marriage with an openness about my own feelings that he had initially found almost bewildering given his own upbringing, gradually coming to recognize that my willingness to express genuine emotion openly had never once compromised my own considerable inner strength or capability. He said watching this particular model, sustained consistently across years of our marriage, had slowly dismantled an assumption he had carried, largely unexamined, since childhood. That emotional restraint and genuine capability were somehow linked, false equivalents he said he now recognized clearly as simply his own father's particular limitation rather than any universal truth about effective leadership or genuine strength. We welcomed a son, Enzo, 3 years after that particular dinner, and I watched Rocco's careful emotional reticence soften considerably further with his arrival. A father who found himself, almost involuntarily, pressing affection toward his young son with a directness that would have seemed impossible during our own earliest years of marriage. Salvatore mentioned once that he had noticed Rocco telling Enzo he loved him with a casual regularity that still occasionally caught longtime associates by surprise. Evidence, Salvatore said, of exactly how thoroughly that original dinner had permanently altered something fundamental in Rocco's own emotional expression going forward. I remember the specific evening Enzo was finally born, Rocco holding him carefully for the very first time with an overwhelmed, careful tenderness that immediately reminded me of the same vulnerability I had witnessed at that engagement dinner years earlier, a man momentarily stripped entirely of every careful defense he otherwise usually maintained around anyone outside our own immediate household. He told me later that same night that he had made a private, immediate commitment, holding Enzo for the first time, never to let his own son grow up uncertain of his father's love the way Rocco himself had once been uncertain throughout his own childhood. I watched Rocco honor that commitment consistently over the following years, a father who told Enzo he loved him not just occasionally, but as a genuine, regular refrain woven throughout their daily interactions, bedtime routines and morning goodbyes alike, carrying the same easy, unguarded affection that had once required an entire engagement dinner's worth of accumulated warmth to finally break through decades of careful reticence. There was a particular incident, roughly 2 years after Enzo's birth, when Rocco's own father, aging and increasingly reflective about his own life's choices, witnessed his son's easy affection toward Enzo during a family gathering and pulled Rocco aside afterward, admitting, with more vulnerability than Rocco had ever previously witnessed from him, that he deeply regretted never having expressed similar affection toward Rocco himself throughout his own childhood. Rocco told me this conversation had moved him considerably more than he initially expected, a rare moment of genuine connection with a father who had spent decades modeling exactly the emotional distance Rocco had spent his own adult life quietly, gradually working to overcome. I remember Rocco describing that conversation to me afterward, his own voice carrying an emotion I rarely heard from him even in our most intimate moments together, understanding that witnessing his father's genuine, belated regret had represented its own kind of significant, painful gift, a rare glimpse into an inner life his father had spent decades carefully guarding from view even from his own son. I asked Rocco whether that conversation had changed his relationship with his father in any lasting, concrete way, curious whether the admission had produced genuine reconciliation or simply a single moving moment that faded back into their usual careful distance. He told me the relationship had genuinely shifted afterward, his father making small, consistent efforts toward warmer expression in the years that followed, imperfect but genuine attempts that Rocco said he had come to appreciate precisely because of how much they clearly cost his father to offer after a lifetime of careful reticence. I asked Rocco once, reflecting on that entire arc of change, whether he ever regretted the years of careful reticence that had preceded his eventual softening, wondering whether earlier openness might have spared both of us some unnecessary distance during our own early marriage. He told me he did carry some genuine regret about those earlier years, though he had also come to understand that the specific journey toward his own eventual openness, however gradual, had been necessary given the particular emotional inheritance he was working against, and that the timing, however imperfect, had ultimately produced exactly the marriage and family he had always genuinely wanted. There was a particular case, roughly 5 years into our marriage, when Enzo, then a curious 4-year-old, asked me directly one quiet afternoon why his father sometimes seemed extra careful about certain specific words, having apparently noticed some subtle, lingering hesitation in how Rocco occasionally approached emotional conversations, even as his overall affection had already grown considerably more open and easy over the intervening years. I told him, as honestly as his young age reasonably allowed for, that his father was still quietly learning some things that had been genuinely hard for him when he himself was younger, and that Enzo could help simply by continuing to love his father exactly as openly and freely as he already did, without ever needing to hold back or hesitate the way his father sometimes still occasionally did. I mentioned this small conversation to Rocco later that same evening, uncertain whether he would find it moving or uncomfortable that Enzo had noticed even this residual hesitation. He told me he found it moving, understanding that his son's own perceptiveness represented, in its own way, further evidence of exactly the kind of emotionally attuned household he had worked so deliberately to build, considerably different from the household that had shaped his own more guarded childhood. He told me, that same quiet evening once we were finally alone together, that he genuinely intended to have a direct, honest conversation with Enzo soon about this particular observation, wanting his son to understand clearly that noticing and naming emotional patterns, even small hesitations like the one Enzo had apparently already detected, represented exactly the kind of emotional awareness he sincerely hoped Enzo would carry forward into his own eventual adulthood, considerably more developed and available to him than Rocco's own had been at a similar young age. Salvatore retired from active operational duties roughly a decade after that particular engagement dinner, transitioning into a quieter advisory role, and he told me, at the small gathering marking that transition, that the moment remained, among the many memorable incidents he had witnessed across 2 decades of close friendship with Rocco, the one he found himself thinking about most often, a specific, vivid reminder of exactly what genuine tenderness looked like when it finally broke through decades of carefully maintained composure. At that same retirement gathering, one of the younger associates who had joined the organization only after the original engagement dinner asked Salvatore directly why the story had become such enduring internal folklore, curious what exactly made a single moment of personal emotion carry so much lasting weight among men, accustomed to considerably more dramatic professional accomplishments. Salvatore considered the question seriously before answering, telling the younger man that most powerful men in their particular world spent their entire careers carefully performing invulnerability, and that watching a boss risk genuine, public vulnerability for something that actually mattered had taught an entire generation of the organization's members something considerably more valuable than any performed toughness ever could. I asked Salvatore once, myself, whether he thought Rocco had ever fully understood, in the moment itself, exactly how significant that particular declaration would eventually become within the organization's own internal mythology. He told me he did not believe Rocco had thought about any of that at all in the actual moment, that the entire declaration had been a purely instinctive response rather than any calculated gesture, and that its eventual significance had simply accumulated afterward, entirely unplanned, through the accounts of everyone fortunate enough to witness it directly. I found myself agreeing entirely and completely with Salvatore's careful assessment once he finally offered it, having personally witnessed firsthand the specific, entirely unguarded quality of that original memorable moment, understanding fully that its considerable eventual weight within the organization's own institutional history had emerged organically and naturally rather than through any deliberate, calculated design whatsoever on Rocco's part, a genuine, entirely spontaneous moment that simply happened to resonate deeply and lastingly with everyone fortunate enough to witness it directly that particular unforgettable evening years ago. We welcomed a daughter, Bianca, 2 years after Enzo's arrival, and Rocco's demonstrated affection extended just as fully and openly to her from her very earliest days, a specific continuity that told me, watching him with both children, exactly how permanently his own emotional transformation had taken root rather than remaining any temporary softening tied to a single dramatic evening. There was a particular case, roughly 9 full years into our marriage, when Bianca, then 7 years old, asked her father directly at a large family gathering, in front of several of his own associates present that day, whether he genuinely loved her. A question she apparently posed simply out of a child's own straightforward, uncomplicated curiosity, rather than any genuine underlying doubt about the answer. Rocco answered immediately, and without any hesitation whatsoever, telling her plainly and warmly that he loved her more than anything else in the entire world. A declaration offered as easily and naturally as any other ordinary statement might have been, clear evidence of exactly how thoroughly the man had genuinely transformed since that original engagement dinner so many years earlier in his life. I remember watching Bianca's face light up at his immediate, unhesitating answer, and I found myself thinking, in that particular moment, about how differently she was growing up compared to how Rocco himself had once grown up, never once having to genuinely wonder or ask whether her own father truly loved her. The answer simply an established, unquestioned fact woven throughout her entire life rather than something ever requiring active confirmation from him. I mentioned this specific reflection to Rocco later that evening, once the family gathering had finally concluded, and he told me it represented, in his own considered estimation, one of the more meaningful, lasting achievements of his entire life, breaking a generational pattern of emotional withholding that had shaped both his own father and, Before that, likely his grandfather as well. I noticed several of the associates present exchange small, knowing glances during that particular exchange, evidently recognizing, even those who had not personally witnessed the original engagement dinner, that they were watching the continued, lasting legacy of a transformation that had apparently become simply the expected shape of who Rocco now was, rather than any remaining novelty worth remarking upon directly. I asked one of those particular associates directly, a woman named Contessa who had joined the organization's administrative leadership only a relatively few years earlier, what exactly she had personally understood about that specific exchange between Rocco and Bianca that afternoon. She told me she had heard the story of the original engagement dinner during her own onboarding process, presented to her, even then, something close to genuine institutional folklore, and that witnessing Rocco's easy, unhesitating affection toward Bianca firsthand had confirmed, for her, that the story represented genuine ongoing character rather than any isolated anecdote left permanently behind in the organization's more distant past. I found Contessa's particular perspective genuinely quite interesting to hear directly, understanding fully that newer members of the organization now encountered the story less as a single remarkable isolated event and considerably more as an established, foundational piece of the organization's own collective institutional identity. Clear evidence of exactly how thoroughly that one particular evening's genuine vulnerability had gradually reshaped the wider culture Rocco led throughout the entire organization over the many following years since. I think often now about that particular evening, the specific silence that fell across an entire crowded table when Rocco finally publicly voiced something he had spent years carefully reserving for private moments only. I understand now, with a clarity that has only deepened over the years since, that the composed, careful man his organization respects and the tender, occasionally unguarded man I married were never actually separate people at all, simply two expressions of the exact same underlying character, one carefully maintained for his professional world, and one that finally, that particular evening, found its way into the open for everyone fortunate enough to witness it directly.